Sometimes a summer feels as long as a lifetime, and sometimes everything fits into a single second. That summer, for me, was somewhere in between. My name is Eli. I was 16 that summer, old enough to feel like I could fit the whole world inside me, but still young enough to be called a kid. The first time I saw him, the sun was high overhead, the kind of summer heat that melts asphalt. I could hear the stones sticking to the ground beneath my flip-flops with every step. There was a barbecue party in the neighboring town. My mom insisted, "Go, you'll meet people." But I didn't want to meet anyone that day, until I saw him. Luke. He stood there with broad shoulders, wavy chestnut hair, and deep dimples that appeared whenever he smiled. Hands tucked into his pockets, half disinterested, as if he didn't quite belong to this world. Something burned inside me when I looked at him. A small, delicate spark. I didn't know what it was at the time, but whatever it was, it lingered in me all day. Luke was 20. Maybe that's why he looked at me like I was just a kid. "Hey, little guy," he said with a grin, ruffling my hair with his hand. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. In that moment, I hated myself, how small and simple I felt. But he talked to me anyway. And that summer, whenever he saw me, he sat down beside me. "What are you doing out here all alone?" he asked one evening. My feet were in the water, and as the sun set, it left a trail of gold shimmering over the sea. I held a stone in my hand, tossing it over the waves. "Nothing," I shrugged. He sat down next to me. He pulled out a cigarette from his pocket but didn't light it. He just twirled it between his fingers. "You're in high school, right?" he asked. "Yeah." I waited for him to say something else, but he just smiled and gazed at the horizon. In that silence, we said everything. Luke went to the bar almost every night. He met new people, came back at dawn. In the mornings, while my mom had breakfast, the neighbors would talk about Luke's nightly adventures. I would quietly drag my fork across my plate. Even when he was coming back late at night, sometimes he'd spot me and say, "Had a good night. How are you, little guy?" Those moments felt like entire novels to me. One evening, while I was sitting on the porch, Luke came over. He had a small can of cola in his hand. He held it out to me. "Don't drink it. Your mom will get mad," he said with a grin. We sat. We watched the stars. Luke took a deep breath. "Summers here are always good," he said. "Yeah," I whispered. But for me, that summer was only beautiful because of him. I couldn't stop the feelings growing inside me. But he always treated me like a little brother. Every night I wondered, if I were older, would he look at me differently? But summers always ended, just like this one did. Sometimes a summer feels as long as a lifetime. That summer, I grew. But for Luke, maybe it was just a nice friendship. Reunion, the flame's ash never dies. It had been exactly 4 years. Sometimes a season fades from your life without leaving a trace, and sometimes it carves itself deeply into your soul. The marks of that summer had stayed hidden within me for years. I grew up. My hair got longer, my voice deepened. I got into university, started building my own life in a big city. First loves fade with time, right? That's what I thought. On a Saturday evening, I was at a seaside cafe with friends. Rain poured relentlessly, sliding down the windows as we laughed and reminisced about old summers. And right at that moment, he walked in. Luke. Years had passed, but it was impossible not to recognize him. The same confident posture, the same dimpled smile. Only now a few strands of gray wove through his hair. When our eyes met, the spark I thought I had forgotten flickered to life in the depths of my chest. He approached me and tilted his head slightly. "Eli?" he said. The warmth in his voice felt like he wasn't greeting an old friend, but someone he hadn't seen in years yet never stopped thinking about. "Luke," I replied. Just saying his name felt like melting sugar on my tongue. He sat beside me. We looked at each other for a long time without speaking, just like we had on that porch years ago. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I live here now." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "So you really did grow up, huh?" I shrugged with a smile, but a storm raged inside me. That night, we sat together until late. One by one, my friends left, but Luke and I stayed at the table by the sea. The rain had stopped. The ocean stretched out before us like a dark blanket. Luke leaned his arms on the table and turned to me. "I bet you've forgotten me by now." I thought I had. But at that moment, I understood something clearly. No one ever truly forgets their first love. Growing closer. That summer, Luke and I started seeing each other often. It began with coffee here and there, then came evening walks. Sometimes we met at bars, sometimes by the shore like old times. One night, we listened to his old records at his place. The crackling of the vinyl filled the room as we sat in a childlike silence. The space between us grew smaller. Sometimes his hand lingered on my shoulder while we talked, and sometimes our arms brushed lightly. Our lips, at times, hovered just a whisper apart. But he never made that move. I thought everything was fine. Until one evening, his late-night escapades came up in conversation with friends. Every time I felt a knot in my chest. When his friends asked, "Luke, do you remember that guy from the other night?" I looked away. Luke would only laugh. And I found myself wondering if those touches and glances between us were nothing more than a misunderstanding. Unanswered questions. One night, as we walked along the shore, the moonlight reflected on the sea. Neither of us spoke. The weight of silence was heavy. I finally stopped. "Luke," I said. He looked into my eyes. "Did I misunderstand you?" For a moment, he froze. His face grew serious. He looked away. "Eli, you're like a brother to me." Something inside me shattered, like a tiny shard of glass. But I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Then why does it feel so different to me?" Luke stayed silent for a while. Then he took a deep breath. "I don't know," he said softly. But in his eyes, there was something words couldn't carry. A romantic night. For a few weeks, there was a strange distance between Luke and me. But one night, I gathered my courage and called him. "Can you come over? I want to talk." I opened a bottle of wine at home. Soft music played in the background. When Luke arrived, he stood at the door, hesitating to step inside. But when he did, we both had the same quiet smile on our faces. That night, we talked until late. As dawn approached and we sat in silence, Luke placed his hand over mine. When he turned his face toward me, his eyes were serious. This time, he said nothing. And finally, our lips met. Some sparks never fade. Do you think some people come into our lives just to leave a mark? Or does every encounter hold a meaning?